My name is Susan Liddy and I lecture in Mary Immaculate College here in town in the Department of Media Communications, and I have two women I'd like to introduce you here to, Dr.Tracy Fahey and Dr. Alice Feldman. And just to give you a little background on both, Tracy Fahey is head of the Department of Fine Arts and head of the Centre of Postgraduate Studies in Limerick School of Art and Design. Her primary research area is the Gothic, with special reference to the visual arts, and she currently works with research partners on ways that the arts can be applied to conversations around end of life. Alice Feldman lectures in the School of Sociology in UCD. In addition to her research on otherness, marginalities, collective action, she's worked in a variety of research, advisory and volunteer capacities with many civic organisations and other agencies in Ireland involved in anti-racism, interculturalism and integration work. Can I make a start with you, Tracy? What are your thoughts, or what would you like to share with us about your response to the work?
I suppose I've got a lot of responses to it, and I think I speak for everybody here, because this is such an evocative piece, and we all bring to it, I suppose, individual experiences and individual responses. For me, something that came out of it very strongly was this notion of liminality, I suppose, ambiguity. The entire film is presented as this constantly shifting landscape. It's in a state of flux. And this represents so many things. I even love the name, E.gress. So it's the action of going out of a place. So even the name itself is really liminal. It's kind of between states. And I just think that as a piece, it works brilliantly to evoke this feeling of, I suppose, almost uncanniness. There's a familiarity and a lack of familiarity that kind of comes through. There's a feeling that you can identify people, you can identify locations, but everything's melting one into the other. And it's just tremendously evocative, I suppose, of the nature of chronic illness and the idea of a condition that can't be cured but can be managed. And a condition as well which changes. So not only do you have these moments of, and there's some beautiful moments captured there of honest perplexity, when the gentleman in the film is striving for the name of the beautiful singer that he can remember, and he says, I wrote it down, I can't think, it's a curse, it's very hard. And then the words come up, I have it, I don't have it. And then the words themselves disappear, but non-sequentially. So different letters disappear at different times. And it really simulates this feeling of kind of discombobulation, I suppose, where you're discommoded within this familiar universe. And when I start to try to put words on what is an intensely visual experience, because that's, of course, what we're trying to do, I keep kind of coming across phrases like uncanny or liminal, and they're phrases I would associate with my home field of study in the Gothic, but not the Gothic as terror or horror, but the Gothic as a place of inevitable returns. And I think what this film represents is, I suppose, ability and inability to return, to go back, to remember. But it also, I suppose, represents feelings of marginalisation. I think we're going to talk about that a little later, about kind of things that are occluded or hidden from society. But for me, this is a very beautiful series of moments. There's a very poignant line when you hear a voiceover, and presumably by a relative, as one of the ladies captured in film looks at a photograph, and you hear, I wonder, are there times when she often comes back? And it's that idea of something which is ever shifting, ever changing. It ties in with the notion of ambiguous loss, which was really influential for Marie when she was making it. The idea that somebody can be physically there, physically present, and yet mentally absent. And yet, because nothing in this film is cut and dried, it's all shades of grey. So when we're talking about distance and lack of mental presence, we also have this amazing sequence of shots of a very commanding lady who's looking us right in the eye in almost a challenging way, who's very much present in every sense of the word. So I suppose really it represents an ever-shifting condition very beautifully. And I'll just reference, I suppose, a final moment. And that's the mirror moments, as I call them, that actually happen. It happens at the very beginning, where we've got this white mist almost that this figure looms out of, looking at herself in a mirror. She returns at a later stage and has an animated conversation with her own reflection. And for me that was just so poignant, because I was reminded of Lacan and the kind of psychoanalytic notion of the mirror stage, where the infant, typically at 6 months, starts to recognise itself in the mirror. And there's just this inevitable kind of cycle. The moment you first recognise yourself, but when is the moment you last recognise yourself? And it's these kind of ambiguities and, I suppose, beautiful and perplexing questions that this film really throws up.
Yeah. Alice, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, you used the term visceral response, and that was very much kind of one of the first and overriding feelings that I had while I was watching the film, and this sense, and you were talking about liminality and that constant flux, and I felt both in terms of the viewer and how it was affecting me, but how I was sort of trying to sense what that otherworldly world could be like, of this sense of teetering on the edge of what it must feel like, that sort of I have it, I don't have it, I'm back, I'm gone, I'm coming and going, and that sense of flux, and this teetering feeling that you could be on the edge of falling into oblivion. And sort of like that the fear and the darkness and the vulnerability, both for the people in the film, but also yourself, and whether you're a caregiver or a family member, and that whole sense. But at the same time, that sense of, not just oblivion, but also safety, that there were safe spaces in lots of different ways, both in terms of you get the element of the institution and the residence and the home life, those spaces, physical spaces, spaces with people, whether it's family members, whether it's the walking in the hallway, and almost that sense too. I was kind of surprised as well that, especially over the last few years, the notion of the institution that already signals something very negative, institutions that are found wanting, that are punitive, that can't at all provide for us the way they're supposed to, and who's responsible and all that, but that there was, and I don't know, and Marie will talk about this later, but that there was a sense in having structure, and my mom's had Alzheimer's for the last 13 years or so, and that sense of safety within a structure, but also being able to evoke the atmospheres of the landscapes that people are traversing, both internally and externally, and kind of that there is a darkness, there's a fear, there's a vulnerability, but that also dementia patients are thriving and can thrive and do thrive. And because, we've had a long go with my mother, that in different, sometimes there's that sense going and coming, but there are moments of hilarity with her, not necessarily, that can be, and there are moments where she's just doing amazing things, even though they're not the things she used to do, with the same level of consciousness. And I thought that was really important. And around this notion of thriving, the other thing that I think is really important about the film is beyond just an invitation to explore people's individual lives, to reflect on our own lives and feelings and things like that. There's also, without ever, because a lot of times with research and other times kinds of formal inquiries, there's the sort of either obligatory or hopeful aspirational list of recommendations about what do we need to do given these particular circumstances. And I think it's very explicit in the film that all you need do is enter into the film and experience, and you can see what people need to thrive. Family members, caregivers, institutions. If people are thriving in these institutional spaces or in the home, you can see very clearly what they need for that. And I think in that case, it's publicly pedagogical. It speaks to policy, and it shows that link in terms of art as knowledge.
Yes.
Social knowledge as well as political knowledge.
Would you agree with that, Tracy?
Yeah, this is such a lovely occasion because we're kind of responding to the film, to each other, to Marie's intentions.
Yes.
But I loved what you said about thriving, and I think that just keeps coming back to me, is this kind of idea of making a film about what is essentially a medical condition, but doing so in such a gentle and human way that kind of champions the biopsychosocial model of medicine rather than this biomedical thing of it's the disease. But I think it's reflective, though, of Marie's whole practice, which is essentially about art and life, and it's not just, it's so multifaceted because it's looking at what is essentially a serious condition. And this is a serious film about serious things, but it's encapsulating those moments that Alice referred to as well, kind of capturing moments of light as well as darkness, physically and mentally, and I think it's done so rather beautifully. But something else which Alice mentioned was the idea of the institution, and I was very struck by the images of the corridor that kind of kept recurring. And these corridors, in a sense, they're clearly institutional. They've got handrails, the paintings are hung at a very safe height. We can see people being assisted to walk down them. But there's a light that glows at the end of each corridor. And I think that having the corridor, which in itself, again, is another liminal space, it's a space of transition where you're moving from one place to another, where you're not still, becomes kind of emblematic of this idea of life and passage and of a cycle, because I think that really in watching kind of films like E.gress, we're forced to think about things that maybe we don't want to necessarily think about. We think about death, we think about disease. And as a friend of mine is in the audience, Jennifer Moran-Stritch, commented once at a paper that she gave, she was saying, Irish people, we're great with corpses, but we're not so good about talking about the inevitable before it happens. We're great with the wakes, but we're not so good beforehand. We don't necessarily engage with these kind of possibilities of end of life. And in Marie's blog that she's been kind of keeping about E.gress, she mentioned some statistics. I think it's 42,000 people in Ireland who were affected by dementia, over 50,000 people who are working in the caring profession, kind of attending and assisting people who are living with this condition. And it's a tremendous swathe of our population. We're all bringing our stories to this. Una, kind of Susan, Alice, myself, everybody's lives have been touched in some way by this. But I'm fascinated by the fact that it takes something like E.gress to start to stimulate us, to have an open and honest discussion about it. And it brings us, I suppose, to something Alice and I were talking about earlier, which is the notion of the taboo. And why are some areas of life permissible to discuss, and why do we hide others? Why do we keep others secret? Why do we find this so difficult to talk about? And maybe there's an obvious answer there. We all like to believe secretly that we're immortal. And things like E.gress, I think, just so important to remind us that life is in fact finite, and that it's all the richer perhaps because of it. We're all of us living. We're all of us dying. And this film really evokes that, but in a very gentle, very meditative way.
Well, I agree the fact that it is an invitation to have a larger conversation about not even just dementia patients and what's that like, but kind of how we want to live and our responsibilities as a society. I mean, it always links in, the everyday personal life to wider social issues. And because it deals with such sensitive issues and issues of taboo, and a lot of times you hear people say about something someone did that was very brave, that took a lot of courage. And sometimes that's kind of I don't know, I feel uncomfortable about that, maybe vaguely patronizing, but this is really seriously brave and courageous work, particularly because we all bring our different experiences. And of course, we're looking at all of this, we're taking our time, we're talking about the symbolism, we're engaging with kind of how now we've said a lot about what we think Marie was doing and why and how she, but there's also the risk, a sort of very profound sense of risk in terms of her undertaking and her responsibility, not just for her creation of a piece of work that she hopes will be well received, but for the participants and in terms of, in terms of the great risks, because we're all going to have different, and we were talking earlier about what is that fine line, and I mean, I might have experiences both personally or professionally that around my mother's condition, things that I just know so well, and that we are in a position, my family and I, in this point in the journey where we can laugh at things or where we can really embrace the problematic things that you portray. Right? Whereas other people, and that's kind of what we're hoping today, is that our conversation, based on what Marie has invited us, also we can invite and discuss this together as an audience, because in terms of ethical issues, the personal impacts of a piece of work, and in this case, we can know a lot about Marie's practice and the process that she went through and the collaboration, the deep collaboration that she had with the participants who can't necessarily represent themselves. They can't say what they would like or would not like to be included in the film. They have proxies, people speaking for them, and that is a huge responsibility right there. And the ways in which I can imagine for you, because, as someone who does research and, you're put in a position where you have to have some narrative, right, about, and so have I misrepresented, misinterpreted? Will what you conveyed here be misinterpreted? Is it exploitational? We know very clearly that fine balance between aesthetics and a sense of exploitation, things like that. So great risks around that, and even in the way that your own narrative can ultimately silence someone else, because what you've included necessarily means you leave other things out. Again, particularly, it's a problematic relationship that you have because it's very mediated.
And I think just to kind of chime in on that, I suppose, I was very interested in that socially engaged approach as to how this relationship was brokered. How did this film come to be? Now, you can all question Marie about that a little later, but I had lots of questions about how the participants were kind of consented, as Alice was saying. And this was done through third-party consent. And this is absolutely standard in terms of medical trials, etc., that in relation to dementia, where the person is living with the condition can no longer give informed consent. But I think that the way this project was worked with, it was mediated through the Alzheimer's Society. It was very much developed not only in conjunction with the subjects who were filmed, but with their wider families and their wider network. And there's been this constant loop of feedback kind of coming back from that process. And that really, I think, in many ways minimises some of the risks that Alice was enumerating, because this care has been taken as to how the subjects were actually portrayed. And I think the rounded nature of that portrayal has been very important as well, because I was particularly struck by the lady who's represented in front of the photographs, which show her at different stages in her life. And such a poignant reminder that although we're looking at her, perhaps in her dwindling years, that she has this really rich tapestry of life represented behind her. Might be a tapestry that she can no longer access at certain times, but it's there. It's a vivid reminder. She's been beautiful. She's been young. She's still there. She's still looking at us. She's still commanding us. And I think the kind of dignity that's given to the subjects is really important, because there is this sense of responsibility. It's, you know, these people have entrusted themselves to me. Their caregivers have entrusted these people to me. I need to maintain their dignity. I need to make sure that they're being portrayed in a way that they're comfortable with, and that the people dear to them kind of feel a sense of comfort without compromising, I suppose, the aesthetic as well. So it's a very particular kind of set of dilemmas, I suppose, that Marie has faced, and that other artists have faced, who've been trying to kind of broker these engagements.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.